Now, the government shutdown has put millions of Americans at risk of losing their SNAP benefits, crucial for putting food on the table. Now, so far, the Trump administration has shown little sympathy with its request to block a lower court's ruling for funds to be paid in full for November, rejected again by a federal court this weekend. Now, meanwhile, the Agriculture Department directed states to, quote, immediately undo food stamps for those in need. Author Marion Nestle says she's shocked by how low-income families are being used as pawns in this political chaos. And she joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss the impact. And her new book is What to Eat Now.
Paula, thanks. Marion Nestle, thanks so much for joining us. Your most recent book, What to Eat Now, it is kind of an update on a book that you wrote back in 2006 on what to eat. So why did you feel you needed to write this? Why did you feel you had to do it now? What's changed?
Well, I thought it was going to be a really quick project that I could just whip off. And here we are 4 years later. It turned out to be an enormous job looking at everything that has changed in the last 20 years. The big ones are online ordering, plant-based, ultra-processed, the introduction of international foods into every section of the supermarket, the substitution of water for full sugar sodas. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. In every section of the supermarket, there have been profound changes that occurred. I just wasn't paying close enough attention.
What's interesting is that you kind of look at this supermarket through the lens of decisions that most consumers don't know might have shaped the food that they're seeing on the aisles, what aisles they're seeing it, or what height they're seeing it at, right?
Right. I mean, this is a book that sort of exposes the obvious fact that supermarkets are not social service agencies, and neither are food companies. They're businesses with stockholders to please. Their purpose is to get you to buy as much food as you possibly can, as often as you possibly can, at as high a price as they can get away with.
You've got nothing short of 44 chapters about every possible section, every possible subcategory in the aisles. One of the examples that you point to that I don't think most people think about is just bottled water. I mean, how profitable has water become for the industry? And I guess, what are the societal costs for the rest of us as we seem to embrace this shift?
One of the things I did was to go to a water treatment plant in upstate New York to look at how they monitored the quality of water coming out of the tap. Boy, it's pretty impressive. And nowhere near that kind of monitoring goes into looking at bottled water. And one of the things I do in the book is I do price comparisons. So I look at the price of water that comes out of the tap, which is less than tenth of a penny per gallon, and then look at how supermarkets sell water. And you can buy bottled water for $1 a gallon if it's tap water that's just filtered, or you can spend up to $40, $50 or more dollars per gallon if you buy bottled water in fancy bottles with additives of one kind or another. And the whole thing is crazy. This is just water.
You kind of really look at the design of a supermarket as something that companies have figured out how to maximize profit, not necessarily health. So give us an example of something that a supermarket shopper should become a little bit more conscious of, and then maybe they can change their behavior accordingly.
Well, first of all, the supermarket is designed to get you to do as much exploring of the real estate as you possibly can, because the rule is the more products you see, the more products you buy. So one objective is to get you to look at as many products as possible. And companies pay supermarkets to put their products in places where you can't miss them. So this would be at eye level, and it would be at the end of aisles. That has a special name, end caps, and at the checkout counter. When you see products at a checkout counter, let me tell you, those are not there in any random order. Companies have paid many, many thousands of dollars to get those products placed in the checkout counter so that while you're checking out, you just kind of mindlessly grab whatever it
Yeah.
is that's there. And this is all done based on the most astonishing amount of research. I can't believe the amount of research that goes into trying to figure out what makes people buy products. And this has to do with the color of the packaging, the size of the packaging, the placement of the packaging, the lighting in the store, the way the aisles are designed. Nothing in there is random.
And you're making it sound like a casino where there are no clocks, there are no windows by design, right?
Well, yeah, and the company always wins.
That's right. So yeah, you also write that as much as 40% of the food produced in America is thrown away. So it's like we actually have, the ability to provide calories for people who need it, but it's kind of how we're designing these calories, what kinds of food we're putting them in, that really you're saying that waste is built into our system today.
We see waste as a food system problem because in the United States, our food supply supplies 4,000 calories a day for every man, woman, and little tiny baby in the country. That's food produced in the United States plus imports, less exports. It's not what people are eating. It's what's available for consumption. Food companies have to sell that food. So they are trying to sell twice as much food as the population actually needs. So waste is built into the system. But that waste is not equitably distributed throughout the food system. 70% of the waste occurs at the farm level, at the production level. It's due to bad climate, it's due to bad crops, it's due to all kinds of problems that occur. only 10% of it occurs at the supermarket level. Supermarkets are really good at inventory control, and they manage their waste pretty well. 20% of it occurs in the home. It's the extra vegetables that got rotten in the refrigerator. It's the cheese that got moldy. It's the milk that was there too long. And that you as an individual could do something about, but that's only going to be 20% of that 40%. But still worth working on.
We've had conversations on this program before about ultra-processed foods and how essentially people eat more calories when they're ultra-processed calories than if, just was a bag of carrots, so to speak. So explain for us, how it is that now more than half the calories, according to the CDC, that we're eating are ultra-processed food calories.
Well, this occurred because of that 4,000 calorie a day problem. You have to sell food. So one way to sell food is to make it irresistibly delicious. So food companies have figured out ways to make foods that you can't resist, and put those foods in places where you can't miss them. And also provide foods in larger portions that have more calories. If I had one concept to get across, it would be that larger portions have more calories. Trust me, it's not intuitively obvious. But the ultra-processed food thing it's a new concept. It's a new way of describing this category of foods. And it refers to industrially produced foods that don't look anything like the foods that they came from. And they're formulated with a lot of additives for texture, flavor, and color that kind of cover up the idea that they're not real foods anymore. And now there's research that shows that eating a lot of them is very bad for our health. Yeah. And that for reasons that are not yet fully understood, they encourage us to eat more calories and not realize it. And not only a few more calories, but tons more calories a day. No wonder everybody's gaining weight.
During Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation hearings to become the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, he called ultra-processed foods poison. But some of his concern seems to have decreased when it comes to now, I guess, what the government is going to be trying to do, whether it's even trying to decrease them or just define them, what the health guidelines and dietary guidelines are going to be. That date has been pushed back now till December
Well, he got hit by lobbyists, just like everybody in government did. Kennedy is a complicated, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a complicated figure because when it comes to food, because on the one hand, he has been calling for a reduction in ultra processed foods, make America healthy again. Let's get rid of some of the harmful additives that are in food. Let's get rid of mercury in fish. A lot of the things that he called for seem to me to be really good ideas. And he scored two big, maybe three wins so far. One of them is he's gotten food companies to agree to take artificial colored dyes out of food products. But if you take the color dyes out of a sugar sweetened cereal, it's still a sugar sweetened cereal. If you take the color dyes out of candy, it's still candy. I don't think that's going to make a big difference to health. On the chemicals, he's gotten the FDA to say that it's going to do a better job of deciding which chemicals are generally recognized as safe. So those are wins. I'll grant that. Another Maha win is that Coca-Cola has agreed to substitute cane sugar for high fructose corn syrup. That is nutritionally hilarious. It's not going to make any difference at all. The calories will be the same, the sugars will be the same. So this is all very complicated and must be taken in the context of Kennedy's destruction of the public health system, destruction of the CDC, making the FDA a dysfunctional agency, and destroying the research apparatus, not to mention what he's done about vaccinations, which I consider to be one of the great public health achievements of the 20th century. So complicated.
Right now we are, as we record this conversation, still in the middle of a government shutdown, and that has disrupted supplemental nutrition SNAP payments. And then there's new rules really even blocking grocery stores from offering any other discounts to SNAP recipients. So there's right now millions of Americans who might only receive possibly up to half their SNAP benefits. A judge has said that the administration has to fully fund these. I mean, what are the consequences, especially to this population who might not have access to healthy foods in the first place, and the SNAP benefits are part of a real crucial part of how they get nutrition?
Well, yes, and we're talking about 42 million people here who are beneficiaries of SNAP. Most of them are people who have jobs, but their jobs don't pay enough for them to support their families and feed their families adequately. And the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is a lifeline for them for food. And the idea that the government shutdown has cut off those funds is quite shocking. And even more shocking is the Department of Agriculture's decision to punish retailers who are trying to help the poor with maybe giving them discounts or doing something that will make it a little bit easier for their dollars to go further. It's quite shocking to use the poor as a pawn in this ridiculous political situation that we're in now.
I think we've known about this for a while, but I think it's becoming in more sharp relief that there's a direct correlation between the cost of a calorie and how nutritious it is. The cheaper it is, the worse off it is for you. I mean, you can kind of find out when you go to, a dollar store, for example, which are real huge in huge parts of rural America and even in general food deserts, where technically, if that's the only kind of grocery store you have, versus a store that might have fresh produce, it is very likely to have a very different effect on your body if the bulk of your calories are coming from the dollar store versus from just a grocer.
Well, it's not just likely. We have an enormous amount of research that shows that people whose diets are based on ultra-processed foods are not as healthy as people who eat more healthfully. The dollar stores have to have some fruits, vegetables, grains, fresh foods, because in order for them to accept SNAP benefits. They're required by the Department of Agriculture to have a certain number of fresh foods. But I've been to dollar stores, and oh my goodness, you don't want to buy your produce there. It really doesn't look very good. So we need to have a food system that serves people better in the United States. And that's why I think food is political, because these are political issues. They're political choices. We could feed everybody in America. We could give everybody in America a universal basic income. We could have universal school meals for kids. We could have restrictions on marketing of ultra-processed foods to kids and warning labels on some of these foods like they do in other countries. There are a lot of things that we could do politically that would help people eat more healthfully. I think one of the most important ones would be to subsidize healthier foods instead of the foods that we are subsidizing. These are political choices.
The pushback against this relatively simple idea of saying, hey, tax the things that are unhealthy and encourage the things that are healthy, is that we hear, this sort of political backlash saying, look, I don't want to live in a nanny state. I don't want to be told what cookies I can eat and what I can't. This is against the core values of America and independence. What's the flaw in that thinking?
Well, I think we already live in an environment in which choices are made for us. We just don't realize it. So it's not a question of imposing some kind of new order on the population. It's a question of tweaking the existing order to promote health rather than the current system. I don't see anything that's wrong with that. That seems just fine to me. You still have a choice. It's just that the easier choice will be healthier. What's wrong with that? Seems like a really good idea to me.
One of the things that you asked for and in the book with is kind of a call to action and reminding people that this isn't just sort of a health choice, that there are personal choices, political choices that all get rolled up into this. What does taking action look like on a consumer level, on a societal level?
If you're trying to eat healthfully in today's food environment, you are fighting a multi-trillion-dollar industry all by yourself. I mean, you can't do that. You can't. You're not going to. You can make healthy food choices for yourself and your family. That's terrific. But to do more than that, you must join with other people. Advocacy requires as many people as possible to be working towards the same goal. And that means joining organizations that are working on these issues. It means writing your congressional representatives. It means running for office. Please run for office. If you want political power, that's what you have to do. And we have learned recently in the United States that some people can win elections, even if they have ideas that don't seem mainstream. So it can be done, and the recent election should be an incentive and an inspiration for lots of other young people to run for office. Please, we need you.
The book is called What to Eat Now. Marion Nestle, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, this week marks 80 years since U.S. atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, devastating two of Japan's major cities and killing an estimated 200,000 people. While this brought an end to the Second World War, the tragic legacy of the bombings still lingers today. Now, historian Garrett Graff takes us back to that pivotal moment in his new book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. Gathers hundreds of accounts of those involved in the bombings, from the crews of the B-29 bombers to the decision makers. He joins Walter Isaacson to discuss the scientific, political, deeply personal impact of how the bombs came to be.
Thank you, Bianna and Garrett Graff. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
This is your third oral history book. You did one on D-Day, you did one on 9/11. Why the format of an oral history, especially when you're not really interviewing most of the people, it's gathering their interviews from the past?
Exactly. This book is coming, of course, at the 80th anniversary this month of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings and the end of World War II. And I think this 80th anniversary feels so poignant to a lot of people because it marks the unofficial passing of the last of that greatest generation. And so for me, what I wanted to do with this project and with my D-Day book last year was, this is a moment when we have effectively every first-person memory of World War II that we're ever going to have. And so as these events slip from living memory into history, I wanted to try to take readers back to these epochal events in the shoes of the people who lived them firsthand. I love narrative history, but there's often a sense in narrative history that events are sort of neater, cleaner, and more preordained than they actually felt to any of the participants at the time. So I think there's a unique power in oral history of sort of going back in the words of the people who lived them to a moment when the outcome of these events was uncertain to them. So, you're going back and sort of hearing from the physicists at moments when, like, they didn't know whether Adolf Hitler would get the bomb first. They didn't know that the U.S. and the Allies would even win World War II. They didn't know whether the atom bomb would work at all.
What did you discover that was slightly different by doing it based on them talking at the time?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you really come through when you look at the sort of diversity of voices in a project like this is, I think we oversimplify the story of the Manhattan Project so often to J. Robert Oppenheimer and his band of merry physicists on a mesa in Los Alamos. And what you really see in this full scope and scale of the Manhattan Project is how much of this was about America's industrial might. The secret cities that we built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, where we refined uranium and plutonium, in factories and facilities and cities that had been carved out of, orchards and, mountain valleys, that by the end of the war housed and employed 100,000 people apiece. The bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in August 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped, was one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States. And no one knew it existed at all, and the city didn't appear on any public map anywhere in the United States.
Just hearing that and reading it in your book makes me think, could we ever do that anymore? I mean, we can't build a rail system in California after 20 years.
Yeah, and I think that there is a lot to be said about what this era meant in terms of sort of news consumption and, the ability of these mountain communities and desert communities in Eastern Washington to keep secrets back then that could never hold in the age of the internet. But I do think that there is, there's some very important modern relevances of looking back at this project today. First, the Manhattan Project rewrites the way that government thinks about science and technology as a core national strength. There's this deep irony in the first couple of years of the book where you have this group of mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing Europe, showing up on the shores of the United States in the late 1930s and sort of pleading with the U.S. government to launch an atomic bomb effort, and the military wanting nothing to do with it. And they sort of say, basically like, science has no place in the military. The military is all about war fighting and logistics and morale. And, we don't need a weapon like this. And then, of course, the military gets pretty excited about the atomic bomb a few months later after Pearl Harbor.
One of the people who changes that, and you got him in the book, is Vannevar Bush, who compared this to building the pyramids. And he's the one who puts together that government, private, academic consortium that does so much. Tell me about his role.
Yeah, this is, of course, where America's sort of begins to knit together government and science and technology. There's a quote in the introduction of the book where, the story that we tell of World War II is about where the battles are fought. Bastogne, D-Day, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa.
Yeah,
But
Omaha Beach.
Exactly. But where the war is really won is in laboratories at MIT where radar and the proximity fuse are developed. It's won in the laboratories at Los Alamos and in the code breaking rooms of Bletchley Park in the UK with the German Enigma. And that, as much as we think of World War II as a story of the servicemen in Europe and the Pacific, it really is a war that is as much a story of scientists and mathematicians.
But it's not just the scientists in your book. What really struck me was like the Ford Motor Plant and Willow Run and our ability, which I feel we've lost a little bit now, to do manufacturing at scale quickly.
Yes, and that's really where the magic of the Manhattan Project comes in. I mean, there's a reason that the Manhattan Project today remains a code word for daring and audacity, and part of that is in these early months you have physicists at the University of Chicago beginning to map out on pieces of paper. I mean, remember, this is an era, they're all working with slide rulers. There are not computers that are aiding this engineering for most of the war. And with their slide rulers and butcher paper, they are starting to map out how to build and refine plutonium in orders of kilograms at a time when plutonium has never actually been even seen by the naked human eye, and it literally exists in the United States only in microscopic amounts.
You talk about those people who convinced the military, and for that matter, President Roosevelt, to do the bomb, a lot of them the Jewish refugees. Tell me about the role of refugees and whether that has some relevance today, too, when we're not allowing in as many foreign scientists.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, this in too many places feels like a history book that should be filed under current events in the bookstore. Because, again, this atomic bomb project would have never gotten off the ground without the leadership and the imagination of the Jewish refugee scientists who flee fascist Europe, come to the United States in the 1930s and 40s. And in that sense, one of the things that really stands out for me in the book is when we talk about the atomic bomb and the 80th anniversary this month, we immediately leap to thinking about Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war in the Pacific. But the atomic bomb is entirely rooted in fascist Europe and the rise of Hitler's Third Reich. And it is, in fact, the motivating factor for these scientists is they know the German scientists left behind, like Werner Heisenberg, who they fear are at work themselves on an atomic bomb. And so their motivation, day in, day out, for most of the 3 years of the Manhattan Project is to build the atomic bomb before Hitler does.
You talk about Oak Ridge. There's a wonderful scene or discussion in the book about the young women in Oak Ridge, the high school graduates in the race. I think it's to produce plutonium, right?
Uranium, yeah.
And tell me about how that was important.
Yeah, and this is sort of, again, we're talking about the sort of industrial power of the United States and the role of, Ford Motor Company building bombers, or DuPont and Tennessee Eastman end up the big corporate players in the Manhattan Project. And in that Oak Ridge facility, Tennessee Eastman is looking around at what its labor workforce could be, as they need to hire, thousands and tens of thousands of workers in remote mountain Tennessee outside Knoxville. And they settle on high school girls from the surrounding community. That's who's left in the workforce by 43, 44. And you have all the fancy California, Berkeley PhDs saying, we don't think these women can actually operate these uranium refining machines called calutrons. And then they put them in a head-to-head test, and it turns out the teen girls in Tennessee outperform the California PhDs in uranium production. And what is just so incredible, again, about the secrecy of this is most of those women who were known at the time as Calutron girls, worked on those, machines, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day, refining and creating uranium, and heard the word uranium for the first time when Harry Truman announces the existence of the Manhattan Project on August 6, 1945. They never knew what they were doing behind those machines, what was coming out the other side, and what they were contributing to the war effort.
When you talk about people not really knowing all the steps in the process that they were contributing to, that goes all the way up to Harry Truman, who I don't think knew about the making of the bomb until Franklin Roosevelt dies and Truman suddenly becomes president. Tell me how that secrecy worked.
Yeah, and this is, to me, one of the most amazing scenes in the book is Franklin Roosevelt dies in spring 1945. Harry Truman is sworn in, and Secretary of War Henry Stimson sort of stays after the first cabinet meeting with Truman and pulls Truman aside and says, "There's really something I should come talk to you about." And then sort of shows up with this briefing, where he brings Harry Truman into the fold for the first time about the existence of the Manhattan Project, the idea of an atomic bomb, and the fact that at that point they are mere weeks away from having the first working nuclear device in the world.
And there's a decision made to drop the bomb. But it's not actually a clear decision. It's not like they have a very formal process and Truman makes a decision. It seems almost as if just instinctual that he does it. How is that decision made, and did he have any regrets?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what you might call the permission structure for the atomic bomb in the spring and summer of 1945, because we look back on that event as so singularly transformative. The only time we ever use these weapons in combat in human history. But at the time, we were involved in this incredibly brutal and deadly war with Japan. In that spring of 1945, Curtis LeMay is leading bombing missions against Japan, firebombing Tokyo in Operation Meeting House that spring, that kills 100,000 Japanese in a single night, the deadliest night of conflict in human history, and then goes on to bomb a total of 66 Japanese cities, single mission raids that are, destroying 30, 40, 50, 60, even 70% of these cities in single nights.
But did Secretary of War Henry Stimson, wasn't he one of the ones who kind of understood we were going into a new era if we dropped this bomb?
Yes, and they do understand that this is a bigger bomb, that this is a different type of weapon, but they don't necessarily think about it in the same sort of stark terms of civilian deaths that I think we now think of nuclear weapons.
So in retrospect, were we right to drop the first bomb in Hiroshima?
It's a really complicated question. I don't think we will ever satisfy it one way or another. I think all of the following are true. The dropping of the bomb certainly saves American lives. It probably saves Japanese lives. I mean, again, one of the things people lose sight of is Japan is in the midst of a naval blockade with widespread famine, and there are 200,000 Japanese civilians dying every month of starvation by the summer and fall of 1945. And at the same time, I think it is hard to look back and think that these are weapons we could ever use again. I mean, I think that there is...
But we used them again in Nagasaki a few days later. Was that justified?
in future conflicts. I think it is right that sort of the central defining organizing principle of geopolitics after the war becomes never using these weapons again.
Are you worried about that?
I'm very worried about it at this moment, and I think part of this moment in geopolitics is we lie a lot closer to nuclear danger than most people, I think, realize. We've already seen this year, conflict between India and Pakistan, which are the two largest nuclear arsenals to ever come into open conflict. We've, of course, seen the U.S. and Israeli raids over Iran's nuclear problem. And we have seen, spreading conversations about nuclear proliferation in Europe and Asia as the U.S. appears to pull back from some of its geopolitical alliances.
You went through hundreds of accounts of the Japanese survivors of the bomb. Tell me what you learned from that and what that was about.
Yeah. The final chapters of this book, I go back and forth between the triumph of the American, Manhattan Project workers and the bomber crews that deliver these bombs, and then the tragedy on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The accounts from those cities are as searing as any memories I have ever come across in my historical research. And I think, again, one of the things I really wanted to do with this project is over the next few years, we will see the passing of the last survivors of those bombs. And it's important to me to carry their stories forward as a reminder about why these weapons are not like any other weapon in the human arsenal, and why we need to do everything that we can in our time to carry forward their dream that they are the last survivors of a nuclear weapon.
Garrett Graff, thank you so much for joining us.
Walter, always a pleasure.
Now, North Korea vowed to never give up its nuclear arsenal at a rare address to the United Nations General Assembly on Monday. The announcement comes at a politically unstable time with growing international concerns around nuclear proliferation. Amid these threats, a bipartisan task force has urged the United States to reconsider how it intercepts the expansion of this destructive industry. Ernest Moniz and Megan O'Sullivan, co-chairs of this task force, joined Walter Isaacson with their recommendations.
Thank you, Christian and Megan O'Sullivan and Ernie Muniz. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to be here.
Megan, you and Ernie were among the co-chairs of a report that just came out, and I think it's published recently, on the Task Force on Nuclear Proliferation and U.S. National Security. What was the point of that, Megan?
The origins of the task force, I'd say, go back even just as far as 1964. And we think about, at that time, China detonated a nuclear weapon, and President Lyndon Johnson brought together a group of foreign policy experts to say, what does the next phase of potential nuclear proliferation look like? It was called the Gilpatrick Commission, and they came out with a number of recommendations and considerations that were then implemented and led to 60 years of essentially a period of minimal proliferation of nuclear weapons. We're now at a period where Ernie and our other co-chair, Tino Cuellar from the Carnegie Endowment, we assess that we're at a moment where the potential for greater nuclear proliferation has not been greater in decades. And so again, we are faced with a very rapidly changing geopolitical environment, one that we think lends itself to much greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we convene this bipartisan task force in an effort to, again, look at the question, is this a national security priority of the United States to advance nonproliferation? And if so, are the tools and the architecture that have withstood the test of time for 60 years, are they still well suited to today? And that was the reason that we convened that task force, and the results, as you said, were published just last week.
Ernie, as Megan said, it was chaired 60 years or so ago by Roz Gilpatrick, who was Deputy Secretary of State. But it was a Lyndon Johnson presidential commission. Y'all were self-organized. Is there a problem that we don't have, the government, the president, trying to figure this out?
Well, Walter, I think clearly, first of all, let me just say that this task force today came to the same high-level conclusion of the Gilpatrick Commission, namely that nuclear nonproliferation is indeed central to our security and should remain a priority. But this commission was a non-governmental commission, and one of our recommendations and I'll come back to your question, for example, was about the need to really rethink extended deterrence, how our allies considered U.S. security guarantees. There have always been uncertainties, but I would say now, going back to your question, today, some of the directions being taken in the United States by the administration, for example, they do elevate some of those concerns about reliability of U.S. commitments. So I would say that distinction really did come into play in our considerations.
So, Megan, Ernie just talked about extended deterrence, which those of you in the foreign policy business know what it means. But basically, it means don't get nuclear weapons of your own. Don't worry. We, the U.S., will use our deterrent capability so that you don't particularly need them. Do you think that's believable these days, Megan? Is that still a good policy? Why are you all supporting extended deterrence?
Well, there's two important points here, Walter. The first is, yes, the task force was unequivocal in saying that maintaining a robust extended deterrence is absolutely essential to a successful continuation of non-proliferation objectives. Now, we recognize that it is harder today to make that a credible argument to many of our allies. And it's not just at this moment in time, it's really over the span of, multiple administrations that I think many of our allies are questioning America's commitment and reliability. Some of this just has to do with, it goes back to, is America overextended? And I would say particularly now, there are many allies who are questioning whether or not the United States will be willing to use the extended deterrent or to provide the extended deterrent. I think that was one of the reasons why we created the task force, is to say it's a changed geopolitical environment. You have China becoming, a country that has a very large nuclear arsenal. You have Russia now threatening the use of nuclear weapons. You have Iran, a proliferation threat like we haven't seen from Iran before, the current military force notwithstanding, and the questions over extended deterrence.
Ernie, we just heard Megan say that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has been throwing around the implication that he could use nuclear weapons. In a speech that President Trump gave to the military this week, he kind of addressed that. And he was talking about Putin saying, President Trump said he had moved to submarines because of it. And he says, we cannot let people throw around that word, the N word. And by N word, he meant nuclear. Do you think that President Trump is on this page, that we really have to keep a deterrence and also keep a non-proliferation policy?
Yes, I do, actually. And in fact, just to elaborate slightly on what Megan said in this context, part of the extended deterrence is, in fact, the idea that our allies need to, frankly, strengthen their military postures, and then have those postures integrated with our nuclear deterrent. Strengthening their conventional postures is, of course, very consistent with what the president has been advocating. I would also say that with regard to Russia specifically, but also I would say China, clearly a lot of the success in nonproliferation during the Cold War and beyond the Cold War came from great power relationships, the U.S. and the USSR, and then Russia, working together despite disagreements on a shared interest in nonproliferation. That continues today. It's a little bit creaky, shall we say, the great power coordination, but is something where we again recommend re-engaging in that, despite the differences with both Russia and China. Now, President Trump. One other thing, Walter, I'd just add is that President Trump, long before he was president, going back to the 1980s, in fact, was speaking out against nuclear weapons. He has spoken many times about trying to decrease their role in our security posture. And in fact, it was just earlier this year in May where Vice President Vance explicitly said that the president, I think to use his words, hates proliferation, and I hate proliferation. So I think there are elements there to build on, and that's exactly what our report tries to address and to make suggestions. For example, I'll end by just saying that one of the recommendations is that the three countries perhaps even expanded to other nuclear weapon states, at least the 5 original weapon states, if not more, could, for example, collectively commit to not threaten or use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Well, that would be an incentive for them, in fact, to stay
Well, Putin just did the opposite.
I'm sorry?
Well, President Putin just did the opposite.
No, so
nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state, Ukraine.
Exactly, and that's one reason why I have said for sure that President Putin really crossed a line there and did something unprecedented. The idea here is it would be great to put that genie back in the bottle. It's not easy. But that kind of negative security assurance would be, we think, quite effective if we can get there. And I think the president would be interested in going in that direction.
Megan, talking about Ukraine, Ukraine had nuclear weapons when it ended up not being part of the Soviet Union anymore. And we convinced them to give up the nuclear weapons by saying, don't worry, you don't need them, we'll defend you. Boy, that doesn't make me feel very confident that we can talk other countries into doing that.
Well, I think there's, as you know, Walter, a very long history there and contested in some ways. But I think the big point that you're making is a very valid point, that many countries around the world not only look at Ukraine and giving up nuclear weapons that were on their soil when the Soviet Union dissolved, but they also look at the Libyan example or the Iraq example, and they think, countries that give up nuclear weapons or don't have nuclear weapons are ones that are subject to aggression. And they look at other countries, the most obvious one being North Korea, which is the only country in this century to have acquired nuclear weapons. Actually, against perhaps all odds, you see, the leader of North Korea comfortably in place. And so I think the lesson that many countries have is that pursuing a nuclear weapon could be in their national security interest. And again, the purpose of the task force is to ask how we can recalibrate our policy and upgrade our tools and the architecture that the international community has to kind of make sure that countries aren't making those kinds of calculations, so that they have, new or more credible incentives to stay non-nuclear. So one of the findings of the task force, which I think is very significant, particularly in this political moment, is that, again, a bipartisan group of foreign policy national security experts all agreed that even the U.S. allies should not be in a position to gain a nuclear weapon, that's not in the U.S. interest, that it is in the U.S. interest to convince them not to pursue one. And the reason why this is so significant is some of your viewers may know that, there's an active conversation in Washington about, well, maybe it would be cheaper and more efficient and easier for the United States if some of our allies had their own nuclear weapon. We wouldn't have to provide that extended deterrent in the same way. And this group really concluded that's a very risky approach to take, and we need to invest again in finding a way to ensure that our allies, that they do not need to go down this road in order to guarantee their own security.
Ernie, how could you say with a straight face to the people of South Korea that now that we've allowed North Korea to get a nuclear weapon, they aren't safer and better off with one?
We think that we need to maintain our alliance, if you like, with South Korea. We continue to provide a nuclear deterrent, but what's really important is in an integrated way, improving our conventional capabilities. As a reminder, and you know this quite well, Walter, that the threats to South Korea are not simply from North Korea's nuclear capabilities. They have artillery lined up essentially along the border with South Korea that could pretty much annihilate Seoul. So it really comes down to an integrated regional strategy for security, and that's what we would advocate.
Megan, you're not just a defense expert, you're a whole foreign policy expert. And when we're talking about this, we talk about the need for Russia and China to work together with us to do it. That seems to me that we're in the least capable position we've been in for 20, 30 years to get both those countries to work with us. In fact, somehow we've driven Russia and China into a closer partnership, at least. There's so much we would need to do with both countries, from AI to climate to nuclear proliferation to bio to gene editing. Is there a way we can get back to having a more pragmatic relationships, especially with China?
The answer to your question is sort of twofold. One, in the report, we talk about how having a successfully rejuvenated global non-proliferation regime cannot be done by the United States alone. It has to be done with some kind of cooperation with Russia and China. We're not advocating an immediate resuscitation of talks. We're saying that we're hopeful and we would recommend that those talks happen as soon as is possible. But most important, I think we acknowledge and make the case very credibly that we still have common interest with both Moscow and Beijing in preventing more states from becoming nuclear weapon states. And so, you suggest, could we imagine a world in which we're having productive conversations with them across a very wide range of things? We're saying we should not wait until the relationship is that thawed to pursue these talks, that there are common interest among these three powers in having a world with less proliferation. And therefore, we should try to find ways to pursue this. It's actually interesting, on the day we released the report, it was the same day that Vladimir Putin said that he would be willing to adhere to the limits on the development of nuclear arsenals a year beyond the expiration of the New START treaty, which will happen in February. So in the absence of some kind of, temporary understanding, as of February 2026, the world will be without any limitations on the development of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia for the first time in decades.
Well, let me follow up on that. Do you think the Trump administration will want to extend this, what's called the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talk Treaty?
Yeah, I can't speak for the Trump administration, but it would make to me, and I think, I'll speak for myself at this moment, it would make to me a lot of sense to take Vladimir Putin up on that. I think there might be other motivations that Vladimir Putin has in extending that offer. Perhaps he's looking to, try to muddy the water between, be tough on Ukraine and nice on nuclear matters, or perhaps he's looking for limitations on the Golden Dome project that the Trump administration is committed to. But, without commenting on what other elements might come into that conversation, I would imagine the Trump administration would find it very much in its interest to have more time to be able to develop a follow-on to the New START. And this goes back to Ernie's point about how President Trump has been clear that he is not interested in seeing any more nuclear proliferation around the world. And so this is, this would be something that we should recognize as a positive step, although not mistake it for any kind of, warming of a relationship with Moscow.
Walter, can I just add that I think it's easy to be somewhat cynical about the offer. For one thing, the Russian economy is in no position to greatly expand its nuclear arsenal. Frankly, neither are we in a position to expand our nuclear arsenal right now, given some of the challenges in terms of so-called modernizing the arsenal. Nevertheless, completely agree with Megan that having those guardrails at least extended is a very, very good signal, and one that has to be capitalized on by having other discussions start. Despite the Ukraine situation, we can have other discussions. And by the way, New START, of course, it puts these quantitative limits on, which is what Putin offered to extend. But there are other elements as well in terms of inspections, very, very tricky in this current environment, in terms of data exchange, which could be still possible, certainly alerts in terms of missile tests. So I think the issue is, I very much hope the president will accept the offer, but accept it with the statement, and let's keep talking and get some other things in place.
Megan O'Sullivan, Arnie Muniz, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Walter.
The scenes were chaotic. Last Monday, nearly 2,000 Palestinians released from Israeli prisons as part of the ceasefire deal that also saw the remaining living Israeli hostages finally freed. Who are these Palestinians? Why were they detained? Michelle Martin poses these questions to Sarah Lee Whitson, Executive Director of Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now. And a warning, this conversation does contain content that some may find distressing.
Thanks, Christiane. Sarah Lee Whitson, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to speak to you because you are a human rights lawyer. Your work focuses on the Middle East. In the wake of the, I'll call it a deal, the agreement to at least bring a ceasefire to the Gaza war, a lot of attention has been focused on the harrowing conditions that Israeli hostages had been living under. What's also been taking place is that Palestinians who had been held by the Israeli authorities have also been released. And I think at this point, about 2,000 prisoners have been released. And I don't know that there has been as much attention on the conditions that they have been living under. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, why were these people detained or arrested to begin with?
Sure. There was a massive uptick in imprisonment of Palestinians, primarily from Gaza, but also from the West Bank in the immediate wake of the October 7 attacks. The number of Palestinian detainees held in Israeli military camps or in Israeli prisons more than quintupled. Most of these from Gaza were detained under Israel's so-called unlawful combatants law, which allows it to detain people outside of the state of Israel on allegations of membership in a terrorist organization. But many are also detained under Israel's administrative detention law, which allows Israel's defense minister or military commanders to detain anyone, typically Palestinian, of course, on the basis that they pose a security risk, on the basis of secret evidence that can be renewed indefinitely in perpetuity without the detainee ever even knowing why they're being detained.
About 1,700 of the 2,000 people who were released had never been through any kind of a process, a judicial process. Is that right?
That's accurate, because under the administrative detention law, no one needs to be prosecuted or sentenced in order to remain imprisoned. There are cases of Palestinian detainees who've been held for over a decade under so-called administrative detention on the basis of secret evidence that their lawyers never have an opportunity to actually challenge. And in the wake of these, the past 2 years, detainees have technically had their detention renewed in some kind of a judicial process, but that judicial process has entailed typically a military judge, so a soldier, who has a video call with the detainee lasting, in some cases, less than 2 minutes, where the detention is automatically renewed. So there's no actual substantive review or opportunity to appeal or opportunity to defend oneself for for these thousands and thousands of Palestinians who are detained under administrative detention or under the combatants law, the unlawful combatants law, which is even worse. Because under the unlawful combatants law, the burden of proof is on the detainee to prove that they are not a security threat to Israel, even if they don't know and may never know the basis on which, the secret evidence on which they have been detained.
I understand that about 1,700 of them were held under these terms that you've been describing, this administrative detention. What about the rest?
So 250 to 300 of those who were exchanged as part of the hostage deal include Palestinians who were convicted by Israeli criminal courts under Israeli criminal law for various offenses, some of whom had life sentences against them for crimes committed against Israelis from decades ago, some of whom had been convicted of lesser offenses, membership in Hamas, a variety of different offenses, some from the West Bank. I believe about 150 of those who were released have been exiled. So not only were they released, but they were forced to leave Palestine completely.
No Western journalists have been able to enter Gaza since Israel's military campaign began there when the war broke out in October of 2023. So we are now relying on accounts from people who have been released, family members, et cetera. Do you know, what were their circumstances? Like, who are they?
We know that among the 1,700 released were a handful of children, some women, a few dozen over the age of 60, and so primarily a male population detained under administrative detention and released without any charge ever having been brought against them. So these are people who were never charged with anything.
And by children, you mean what? Do you mean?
The legal definition of a child under international law and actually most U.S. states is 18.
18.
I don't know the numbers, but I do know that the United Nations has classified and reported on them as children. They're probably teenagers. We have a case of one teen who died in custody among the 80 Palestinians who've died in custody over the past 2 years, which is a shocking number. The reports that we're seeing of people who've come out, and I imagine people are seeing them in the news, is of severe torture, severe abuse, sexual violence, rape, humiliation, degradation, and virtually very limited access to medical care. The most disturbing, of course, is the recent revelations that among the bodies of Palestinians returned, 135 of them show that they were executed with their hands tied behind their backs after suffering extreme torture. And the images are so graphic that they actually haven't been even posted on the media. But we have the journalists who've seen the images reporting on them.
And forgive me for, let's be clear for a minute. When we're talking about torture, what do we mean?
Well, what people have reported and what has been documented are cases of rape and sexual assault, in some cases using something called a hot rod to penetrate the orifices. Are you
talking about men and women? Are you talking about males as well as females?
The reported cases we have of actual rape are of men, but there are cases of sexual assault and sexual violence against women detainees as well. The UN has put out extensive reporting on this. Physicians for Human Rights in Israel has reported on this. B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, has extensively documented and reported on this. It includes beatings. It includes a denial of medical care. There's one recent case of a young Palestinian boy, man, I think around the age of 17 or 18, who died of medical neglect and damage to his body as a result of that. One Palestinian detainee, also a young man, was just released completely paralyzed because of infections he suffered from scabies inside the prison, ultimately leading to blood infection and paralysis of his body. We have been warning about the the deteriorating conditions in Israeli prisons for over a year now. Since Minister Ben-Gvir took over the prison services in Israel, he has proudly announced the drastic new conditions that he's imposed on prisoners, depriving them of food, dramatically limiting their intake of food, limiting their access not only to medical care, but even to water, even to electricity, allowing them to shower once a week in many cases, and of course, dramatically restricting their ability to communicate with their family members or even their lawyers.
Let me jump in for a second and just say in July of 2024, Minister Gvir said on X, the social media platform, which is now owned by Elon Musk, quote, "One of the highest goals I have set for myself is to worsen the conditions of the terrorists in the prisons and to reduce their rights to the minimum required by law." Now, we reached out to the Israeli Prison Service for comment about the conditions that Palestinians are being held in. We have not heard back as of this moment, as of our conversation, but they did give a statement to the Washington Post last week where they said, quote, "All inmates are held according to legal procedures and their rights, including access to medical care and adequate living conditions, are upheld by professionally trained staff," unquote. And Israeli officials told the Associated Press that they follow legal standards for the treatment of prisoners and that any violations by prison personnel are investigated. So I guess I would ask you for your response to those comments.
Well, unfortunately, I don't believe that those claims are credible. Even the head of Israel's Shin Bet internal security forces issued a public letter lambasting the prison services and Minister Ben-Gvir for the violation of detainee rights in Israeli custody. The fact that over 80 Palestinian prisoners have died in custody, and that fact that Israeli courts are now criminally investigating Israeli prison officials for the deaths of 34 of those detainees. The fact that countless human rights organizations have documented the near starvation conditions, which we can see with our own eyes with some of the released Palestinians and their gaunt appearance documenting how much weight they've lost. The fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross has been banned from actually monitoring prison conditions is yet another indication. If Israeli prison services didn't have anything to hide, they wouldn't be prohibiting even the ICRC from access. Unfortunately, the Minister Ben-Gvir and the Israeli prison services have I would say little to zero credibility in their claims, which are abundantly rebutted by the actual facts.
As you pointed out, the circumstances under which people have been detained are not necessarily made public. The charges are not made public, or the allegations are not made public. But do you have any sense of the people who remain in detention?
So the estimates of detainees basically over the past 2 years, so not people with pre-existing criminal prosecutions, have ranged from 9,500 to 12,000. And part of the reason for the variance in the number is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people missing, and we don't actually know what's happened to them. So, for example, the 135 Palestinian bodies that were just exchanged as part of the hostage swap had no names attached to them. They had only numbers. Israelis who had detained them never bothered or are not releasing their actual names. And it's really part of the dehumanization process to reduce human beings to numbers.
Of the people who remain in detention, do you have any visibility into who they are, what charges there may be against them, or under what circumstances they were detained?
Of those who have been detained, let's just say in the last 2 years, since the October 7 attack in Israel, there have been criminal charges brought under Israeli criminal law against approximately 300 people. I believe these are people who were captured, while committing the crimes and the murders on October 7. But those are the cases in which there are actual criminal charges. So for the other thousands and thousands of detainees, they are held under two different laws. One is the administrative detention law, and one is the illegal or unlawful combatants law.
Well, first I would say Israeli officials say that these detentions are meant to protect against very real and credible security threats. And they point to October 7th as an example of that. Like, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think every time anyone is detained anywhere in the world, it is to prevent further harm. It's because the person is deemed to be a security risk, not just to punish them, but to prevent them from committing future crimes. That is the whole model of incarceration. But there are global rules that apply to every country in the world, including Israel. Israel is not above the law that applies to the United States or to China or to Russia with respect to how detainees may be treated, with respect to their ability to have access to food, water, medical care, access to a lawyer, a right to connect with their family members. And these are all rules that are enshrined very clearly in international law and that Israel has been neglecting for a very long time, but has, completely abandoned in the past 2 years. I would say furthermore that the notion of having a right to a judicial process, the right to having your evidence against you heard in a court of law, the right to having an independent judge determine whether or not there's a basis for your detention. Those are also globally recognized international laws, globally recognized human rights that the Israeli government has completely ignored because it has for decades imprisoned Palestinians without giving them any real opportunity to challenge their detention on the basis of secret evidence that they can never even know, and a procedure that allows them to be detained forever in perpetuity on the basis of this secret evidence.
There are some who will hear this conversation and will say that that's unfortunate, that's even cruel, it's possibly wrong, but it's rough justice in a way because Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. Women, babies, children, kidnapped. People were held in brutal conditions. People were killed under these brutal conditions. People were starved. Israeli hostages were starved, and Hamas did not conform to any standards of international law or human rights. What would you say to someone who has that point of view?
Well, I would say that the international rules that we have in place, which most countries have adopted as their own laws, such as the Convention Against Torture, they are designed specifically to address circumstances where the citizenry of a nation has been wronged, where they have suffered crimes. There is nothing unique about Israel's experience in suffering a terrible attack on civilians, a terrorist attack on civilians, just as I don't think you could probably point to many countries in the world that haven't experienced horrible crimes against their citizens. The point of international law is that it is the law, and it is what is going to distinguish law-abiding nations, law-abiding governments from lawless governments. Because if the governments act as brutally and viciously as the people they are purporting to fight against, it's really just a race to the bottom. And if you look at the response of Israel to the attacks on October 7, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to say that Hamas's attack and the horrible murders they committed there were somehow worse than the exponentially more massive and indiscriminate and wide-scale destruction of Palestinian lives, which has now exceeded over 60,000, and I'm sure we'll discover exceeds much more than that.
Is the argument here, this isn't like a contest of atrocities here, is the issue here that Israel as a nation state, as a member of the community of nations, should be held to the same standard as other nation states? Is that the core of the argument?
I think it's absolutely the core of the argument, but this is not just about holding Israel to the same standards of international law. It's about recognizing and starting with the understanding that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is unlawful. And the International Court of Justice and the UN General Assembly have ordered Israel to end its occupation, to withdraw its forces and withdraw its settlers from occupied Palestinian territories. Occupation, illegal occupation, apartheid rule, these are also crimes. So this is not just about, well, let's meet the standards of the rest of the international community. It's about rightly focusing on the severe Israeli crimes that international courts of justice have ordered be brought to an end.
Sarah Lee Whitson, thank you so much for joining us.
Next, higher prices, empty shelves, and orders delayed. This may soon become the reality for American consumers. Far from the golden age of prosperity that Trump once promised, now he's warning that people may have to cut back after his tariffs brought most trade with China to a halt. Well, this week, the US and China will finally hold talks, but New York Times reporter Anna Swanson joins Hari Srinivasan to explain that much of the damage has already been done.
Christian, thanks. Anna Swanson, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece recently titled "A Tidal Wave of Change is Headed for the U.S. Economy," which takes a look at the drastic changes that consumers might feel in their homes and other places. But you say that right now, we actually haven't started to feel the full brunt of the impact of the U.S. tariffs on China yet. Explain that.
Absolutely. So tariffs have been in the news for a while, but these changes for the economy really take quite a lot of time to unfold. And if you think about it, it's really because it takes so long for goods to be shipped from China to the United States. Typically, a lot of goods that you're buying are moving on container ships. When they leave the port in China, it can take 20 to 40 days to show up at U.S. ports. And then it might take, another 1 to 10 days to be sent by truck or train around the country. So from the time the president put in very extreme tariffs on China at the beginning of April, you're really looking, kind of to a month timeline before you start to feel the effects for many of these goods. And so it's really right about now that we're starting to see, the level of goods coming in through container ships dropping. And that's something that's just going to keep intensifying over the coming weeks and months, with consumers really starting to feel the effect, I think, going into the summer.
So I'm assuming that as soon as the tariffs happened, if there was a small business in the United States that was importing things from China and they couldn't either afford to or didn't want to pass on the 140% increase to their consumers, they just stopped ordering, right?
Yeah, it is measurable. And we had some new trade data coming out this week as well, which showed that the share of imports from China for March were at a historical low. So definitely those tariffs had led to a pretty sharp drop in trade, especially as you're pointing out for small businesses, which may not have a lot of cash on hand, may not be able to pay that tariff price, which has more than doubled the cost of bringing in goods from China. I would add, though, it is really important that a lot of businesses, particularly major retailers, did a lot of stocking up since the election and earlier this year. So a lot of big retailers do have, a month or a couple months of inventory on hand. And that has also kind of helped to soften the blow. But, as time goes on and these tariffs on China remain really high, you are going to see that interruption in trade. And retailers can't cover that pause, forever. Eventually, consumers will start to see that in the form of higher prices, some empty shelves, maybe longer wait times, or when they're ordering products, or the inability to order certain products at all.
Now, just to keep it in perspective for our audience, are we the biggest customer of China?
Yeah, It's a really interesting question. So the United States is certainly a major export market for China, but it's definitely not the only one. So China's reliance on the United States has fallen in recent years. Used to be, more than a fifth of Chinese products that were headed to the United States some years ago. Now I believe it's more like 15%, maybe a little bit lower than that. So, most Chinese goods actually are not headed to the United States. It certainly is a major export market, a very important market for a lot of Chinese companies. But China, the Chinese government has been sort of standing up to the Trump administration and trying to make the point that, just because of tariffs, we won't necessarily fold to your demands or come running to negotiate. And part of that is because the country is more diversified now and has more export markets that it can sell into.
Okay, and let's look at the other side of that equation. If China is exporting a smaller percentage of what they make to us, are we also importing from lots of other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So, since the first Trump administration, since President Trump put very high tariffs in on China in his first term, U.S. imports from China have dropped as a share of overall U.S. imports. So the United States imports now a bigger share of its goods from other countries like Mexico, Vietnam, countries in Southeast Asia. So you really did see this effect when tariffs went in place that the United States started to buy more from other countries rather than China. Now, in some cases, it was very interesting. That was actually just Chinese companies moving to other parts of the world, or Chinese companies sending their parts to other companies in other places in the world. So there's still a lot of Chinese raw materials and parts that are being imported to the United States, but it did rearrange trade. And it made the U.S. trade deficit with other countries like Mexico, like Vietnam, shoot up. And in this term, the Trump administration has kind of focused their sights on those countries now, too. So there's a bit of a whack-a-mole effect with global trade, where you push down, on part of the balloon with China, the trade deficit just pops up in other countries globally.
You have this fascinating graphic which just kind of looks at the impact of Chinese goods in an average American household. Walk us through what you're trying to illustrate, because it seems that some household goods, it's almost completely China and only China where we're getting these items from.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really remarkable. So my colleagues in graphics put together a visual representation of your house, and you can walk through the house and see, which products mostly come from China or mostly come from other places. And the idea behind it is, yes, U.S. households buy a lot from China, a lot more than you might think, but in some product categories, China produces nearly all of the world's supply. So for things like alarm clocks, toasters, baby strollers, grills, fireworks, it's more than 90% of global products that China is producing. And so the point is that, if we're putting 145% tariffs on China, we're stopping trade with China. Right now, the world just doesn't have many alternatives. For some other categories of goods, you might be able to switch to buying them from Mexico or buying them from the United States or buying them from elsewhere. But China is just such a dominant manufacturing powerhouse that it has really taken over global supply of some of these goods. And there's really nowhere else to buy your thermos or your alarm clock. And so for those types of goods, consumers are more likely to see price increases because of the tariffs.
This past Friday, the de minimis exception for low-value packages expired, meaning anything under $800 was exempted from a tariff. So kind of explain, if you can, what this means for both Americans and for the Chinese.
So the de minimis exception had allowed retailers to send things into the United States without paying tariffs, as long as they were valued at less than $800, and as long as they were sent sort of directly to the consumer or directly to the business. So basically, you had a lot of individual packages that would come to people's doorsteps or even to businesses from China, and those weren't being charged the tariffs in President Trump's first term. And when he put those tariffs on, we did see a dramatic dramatic increase in de minimis shipping. We also saw an increase in de minimis shipping as e-commerce platforms got more popular. So Shein, Temu, these platforms that allow Americans to buy goods directly. So a lot of U.S. manufacturers had complained that this was just very unfair because it was a way for Chinese goods to bypass U.S. tariffs. Other retailers bringing things in via cargo ship would have to pay that tariff, but Shein and Temu weren't, so it kind of upset the playing field. And so the Trump administration on Friday decided to put an end to that. And so that means that, when you bring those goods into the United States right now, you need to pay 145% tariff. It's a very dramatic increase on the cost of a lot of, cheap clothing or everyday items that you might be importing. So it is going to be an issue for those platforms. They're certainly going to have to reshuffle, and we may see their business models change or shrink, frankly, in the time to come.
There already have been exemptions granted for certain categories of goods that we might be importing, right? Whether it's auto manufacturing parts or other things. I wonder if we keep adding to that list of exceptions, are these significant enough loopholes where we're not going to necessarily feel that?
Yeah, so the Trump administration started its tariff measures earlier this year by saying there would be no exemptions, no exclusions to a lot of these measures. But as time has gone on, we have seen some major carve-outs for industry. The most notable one was last month, the president decided to exempt electronics from China. So your iPhone, your cell phone, your iPad are not subject to those, crazy high China tariffs currently. He said that they might be hit with another tariff investigation in the future, but those tariffs are likely to be a lot lower. So that was a very significant source of relief for the electronics industry, and something that seemed to happen after Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, put in a few strategic calls to the administration in the White House. There was also an exemption for some automakers, although that was kind of more minor, carving out tariffs on some parts, but that also followed calls by automakers to the White House. So concern has been growing that, it's really the well-connected companies that are going to be able to get around these tariffs. And those exemptions, they really are worth billions and billions of dollars for companies. So if you're a company, the smartest thing you can do is deploy, your chief executive or your lobbyist to Washington right now to try to get around those tariffs. But it does raise a question of why electronics from China? Why not syringes? Why not baby strollers? What is the logic behind exempting some products and not others? And the administration has not been particularly clear about that.
Are there, we've been talking about, what might seem like smaller objects, whether it's toys or alarm clocks or toasters, but are there any kind of goods that are impacted in our national security pipeline that might be affected and that we should be thinking about?
Well, yeah, in the national security pipeline, we've heard a lot from makers of airplanes and munitions that they are affected by tariffs on steel and aluminum and parts. That particularly raises the cost of building something like an airplane if you have to pay 25% more for your imported materials. I also think the effect on automobiles is really, very pronounced and maybe, not as much a national security effect as an effect for consumers. But a car is the single biggest purchase that most American households will make in any given year. And so we do have 25% tariffs on imported cars right now. We have 25% tariffs on most parts. A lot of automakers are depending on imported foreign parts. And at some point, those price increases are also going to cascade through that supply chain. Some automakers choosing to hold off on price increases, others choosing to go ahead. But that will definitely at some point be felt.
With the economists that you speak with and the data that they look at, how will we judge whether or not either side really won this trade war?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very tricky question because, really the US and Chinese economies, because of these decades of trade, are fairly linked together, right? Our fortunes are kind of linked together. And so severing those connections is going to be painful for both sides. And I think from the administration, the question is kind of, who will be hurt less, who can withstand the pain more. And the Trump administration has really argued that China is more vulnerable to the United States because we are a major market. It depends on the United States for jobs. I think made this calculation that Chinese officials would come to negotiate with them more quickly than they have. But the United States is also vulnerable. I mean, we, unlike China, are a democracy. So when consumers see prices rise, when they start to see shortages, they can speak up very vocally about that. They can express opinions in the midterms. That's something that Republicans are starting to get concerned about. And so I think both countries are sort of vulnerable in different ways, both economically and politically to some extent.
One of the key principles that launched this trade war in the first place was the idea that this would bring jobs back to the United States. How do we measure whether that's happening, how quickly that would happen, and what the impacts of these tariffs are in trying to accelerate that?
Yeah. So I do think that tariffs do work in some instances, right? Tariffs are designed to raise the price of imports, and that makes American consumers more likely to buy domestic goods, right? And there are very real concerns that Chinese manufacturers, because of support from the government or because of other unfair trade practices, they're able to price their goods so cheaply that American manufacturers just can't compete anymore. And then also with tariffs, you do have other issues. So there are a lot of companies that need to import raw materials and parts. And so tariffs mean that they're paying a higher price for that. That can make U.S. manufacturing less competitive. So it's not quite as simple of an equation as you might think. And the Trump administration obviously has been emphasizing that there are companies that are making big investments in the United States. But if you look at the data, it looks like capital expenditure by companies has really fallen off very sharply because of uncertainty due to the tariffs. So, actually, it seems like companies right now are not being encouraged to invest. They're really just holding off to see how this tariff policy might pan out and what's going to be best for them in the future.
So considering that the tariffs now not just impact China, but really every major country on the planet, and that there are essentially, there is still a delay and they could be reimposed, what is likely to happen, I guess, in this 90-day window?
Yeah, so it's kind of confusing because there's so many tariff tranches out there, right? But the president announced really major global tariffs on most countries at the beginning of April. And then for dozens of them, he then paused them for a period of 90 days to make trade deals. And so now that sets up a deadline of early July where these countries are racing to try to make some deal with the United States to forestall those tariffs from coming back into effect. And there are, countries that are coming to the U.S. and making offers, and U.S. trade negotiators are quite busy right now. I think the problem is that it's a very short timeline to do something that's, very ambitious. So typically a normal trade deal would take, over a year to negotiate. And here the Trump administration is trying to do deals with the entire world in the span of just a few months. So that's already very difficult. But again, it just creates a lot of uncertainty about whether tariffs will be going up or down in the next couple months.
Anna Swanson, reporter with the New York Times. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.